In the spring of 1940, Germany routed the Allied armies and conquered France, Belgium, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands in just over 6 weeks. To execute this continental push, the German Air Force assembled its largest armada to date, fielding roughly 4,000 operational aircraft. But a closer look at this rapid conquest reveals a structural problem. The very tempo that secured the victory broke the back of the Luftwaffe. In a month and a half of combat, the Germans lost 1,100 aircraft to enemy action, with hundreds more lost to wear and tear. This chart plots the timeline of the 6-week advance against the volume of destroyed airframes. By the time France surrendered, the Luftwaffe had sustained a 30% loss ratio across its total force. They achieved operational paralysis against the Allies, but they paid for it with an attrition rate they couldn't afford to maintain. To understand why the German Air Force would fail over the English Channel just weeks later, we have to look at exactly how they exhausted their resources securing the French coast. There is a persistent image of the 1940 Luftwaffe as a dedicated close air support force, acting essentially as flying artillery directly above German tanks. That is only a fraction of how they operated. Their actual priority was operational interdiction. The goal was to reach deep past the front lines and seal off the battlefield from the air. Instead of hunting individual trenches, they targeted the structural lifelines of the enemy: airfields, command headquarters, communication centers, and major transit routes. This map displays the Allied defensive posture. British and French air forces were strung out across the entire front line, dispersing aircraft from the Atlantic coast to the Swiss border. The Germans organized their air power differently. They utilized the Fliegerkorps, ad hoc formations of dive bombers, level bombers, and fighters pooled into concentrated nodes. These aerial units were assigned directly to a specific army corps. Wherever the ground forces formed a spearhead, the air forces matched them overhead, applying overwhelming, localized pressure against the thin Allied line. By stripping away the enemy's ability to communicate and move reserves, this concentrated mass induced a state of total command paralysis across the Allied rear. The true test of this doctrine happened in mid-May at the Meuse River. If German mobile units could cross this barrier, they could slice into the Allied rear and cut off the main British and French forces isolated in Belgium. The initial aerial assault relied heavily on Stuka dive bombers to strike the frontline concrete fortifications on the opposite bank. While a steep dive improves precision, vertically aiming a plane moving at high speed at a 10 by 10 meter bunker is incredibly difficult. Most of the French strongpoints survived the physical Stuka attacks. This chart shows the actual distribution of air power during the crossing. The dive bombers flew roughly 500 sorties. The traditional level bombers flew 6 to 8 times that amount. These heavier aircraft bypassed the river entirely. They concentrated their munitions miles behind the fighting, leveling French assembly areas, troop movements, and rail junctions. Meanwhile, German fighter squadrons maintained a continuous aerial shield over the sector, imposing severe losses on the British and French bombers attempting to counterattack the crossing. The French had armored units stationed nearby, fully capable of throwing the Germans back into the Meuse. But with their communication lines severed and their staging areas under constant bombardment, they could not coordinate their response. By May 17th, the Germans had consolidated their bridgeheads. Concentrating combat mass and heavily outsorting the enemy had effectively sealed the battlefield and generated the exact operational paralysis the doctrine intended. After breaking out, German mechanized units raced across the countryside, reaching the Channel coast by May 21st. Then, concerned about an overextended southern flank, the High Command halted their advance. This pause on the ground provided a crucial window of time for over 300,000 Allied troops to begin evacuations from the beaches of Dunkirk. To close the gap, leadership ordered the Luftwaffe to finish the job alone, but they were simultaneously handed 4 conflicting directives: maintain pressure on the main French line, stop the Dunkirk evacuation, pull units back to rest and repair, and begin preparing for operations against Britain. By attempting to do everything at once, they immediately diluted their combat mass. The concentrated pressure that broke the Meuse River line vanished. Furthermore, the sheer tempo of the previous weeks had caught up to them. Pilots were physically exhausted, and a high percentage of the remaining airframes desperately needed maintenance. The Luftwaffe inflicted damage on shipping, but a fatigued, split force lacked the sustained sortie rate required to break the mass evacuation. Dunkirk demonstrated the rigid boundaries of German air power. It was a devastating instrument when aimed at a single point, but it fractured under the strain of managing multiple operational priorities. Seeking to finish the campaign and eliminate the remaining French Air Force on the ground, the Germans launched Operation Paula on June 3rd, sending an armada of 1,000 aircraft toward Paris. It was intended as a definitive knockout blow. Instead, it hit empty tarmac. The French had received advance warning of the attack. Rather than keeping their planes clustered on the targeted airfields, French commanders simply dispersed their remaining squadrons to secondary locations before the bombers arrived. Generating intense aerial pressure achieves nothing if the enemy isn't sitting where you aim it. The effectiveness of the German strike model relied entirely on catching the opponent unprepared. Operation Paula proved that a concentrated first strike falls flat without tactical surprise, a hard lesson the Germans would immediately face against the early warning radar network in Britain. When the French government officially surrendered on June 22nd, the German military had secured an immense territorial conquest, but the bill for that speed was 1,100 destroyed German aircraft. This chart tracks the cumulative damage. Factoring in combat and operational failures, the Luftwaffe burned through a 30% attrition rate in 1 month. However, they lacked the rear echelon production and pilot training capacity to replace this force at the speed it was destroyed. With no pause to rebuild airframes or rest crews, this severely depleted force was sent directly into continuous operations over the English Channel. The entire German air apparatus was built for short, violent sprints to facilitate decisive ground victories. It succeeded in France because the army succeeded, but the doctrine contained a fatal mathematical flaw. If the ground forces ever failed to achieve a rapid breakthrough, the Air Force would be dragged down into a grinding tactical war it could not survive. The Battle of France was a masterpiece of operational concentration that ultimately bankrupted the Luftwaffe's strategic future. In modern industrialized warfare, unmatched tactical tempo is worthless if you cannot sustain the math of your own attrition.